I'm not a superstitious person. I didn't believe in ghosts or demons until now. Yeah, stuff happens that can't be explained, but I just want you all to know that it took more than a couple of flying spoons or a door opening on its own to scare me out of my job. Since the department didn't find any reason to keep this police report confidential, I will now detail you everything I can on what happened on the scariest night of my life. We had just received word from dispatch to check out a noise complaint in a small neighborhood whose name I will not disclose for their privacy. It was me and my partner, let's call him Paul, and I'll go by Mike. We arrive sometime after midnight. The street is dead. Everyone is sound asleep at this point. We park our patrol car in front of the aforementioned house and exit the vehicle. We knock on the door and let our presence known. Police, is anyone home? A little girl, 8 to 10 in appearance, opens the door and peeks through the gap. Hey. I crouch to make myself less intimidating. Is your parent or guardian home? She shakes her head. My first thought was that she probably had the TV a little too high and woke up the neighbors, but before I could tell her to stay inside and lock the doors, then part, I heard the sound of crashing silverware coming from what I presumed would be the kitchen. The entire house was nearly pitch black. The girl answering the door and shaking her head let me know she was alone, which makes whoever made that noise an intruder as far as it concerns me. I ask the girl to step outside and turn to Paul. Paul, why don't you give her one of those lollipops you like to suck on when you're nervous? Paul gave me a cold stare as the girl giggled. They went to go wait by the car as I slowly pushed the door all the way open. Police, if there is anyone in this house, please let yourself be known. Without a warrant, I had no right to enter the building. I tried my best to spot whoever made the noise, but it is too dark to see. Just any sign of a threat, and I would be justified to search the house, but nothing. I left the door open and headed back towards Paul and the girl. Hey again. I don't think we introduced ourselves. I'm Officer Mike. This is my partner Paul. If I may ask, what is your name? Maribel. That's a pretty name. So Maribel, again, if I may ask, where is your family? As soon as I had finished my sentence, the television in the living room turned on, volume fully up. Me and Paul quickly turned in surprise and could see the television playing static from outside. We put Maribel in the back seat of the patrol car for safety, as no civilians were allowed in the front seats. We then, against our better judgment, entered the house. We tried every switch in the house, but no lights came on. While wandering the house cautiously, I would catch a person standing in the mirrors. I thought it was Paul, but every time I looked behind me, Paul was nowhere to be found. As I returned to the front door along with Paul, we both jumped as running footsteps echoed down the hall. We detached our firearms and aimed it at the source. The footsteps got louder and got closer, but no one ever appeared physically. Lamps, chairs, and other stuff started getting thrown around by an invisible force as the footsteps reached us. We sprinted out of the house and waited by the front yard. The footsteps seemed to stop, followed by the police siren that went off. I ran to the car and silenced the siren. I looked back at Paul, who seemed shocked. You all right, Paul? He takes a lollipop out of its package and puts it in his mouth. Yup. I opened the rear door and checked up on Maribel. You okay? She nodded her head, so I walked back to Paul. I don't know what to make of this, he said. Yeah, me neither. No, seriously. Ignore the running invisible man that knocked everything down for a second. All the family photos, pictures on the wall. He points at Maribel. She's not in any of them. So, what are you thinking? The footsteps led outside, then the siren goes off. There's a million buttons in that car. What are the chances? Paul, are you trying to tell me that Maribel is haunted? How do you explain what we just saw? I'm sure there's an explanation. The TV turns on when we take Maribel outside, prompting us to check it out. Someone or something shows up in the mirrors, but ducks away. I remember wanting him to shut up, not because he wasn't making any sense, but because he was. I know you saw it. It was prowling around. Then it runs outside and gets in the car, tries all the buttons. I think a ghost is trying to get to the girl. I just stood there not sure what to say, until Paul decided to start walking back towards the house. Paul, what are you doing? It only shows up in the mirrors. That's how we find it. I followed him inside and watched as he took a book from the counter and broke the nearest mirror. What's the matter with you? That's someone's property. He takes a shard and hands another to me. It's not every day you get to arrest a ghost. We aimed our flashlights all over the house, waiting for something to appear in the broken glass. I recall praying to God Almighty to not let anything show up, but it did. I panicked as it swung its red bony arm at my back. It ripped right through my uniform, causing me to fall forward. I dropped the glass, which broke into smaller chunks. It continued clawing at my shirt and flesh, but stopped when Paul opened fire. I heard it screech, fading as Paul helped me up. We both then hurried back outside to find Maribel missing from the back seat. It was difficult explaining what happened to the department without sounding like nutjobs. The police cameras who were betting on to prove our stories had shut off the moment we entered the house. The thing, whatever it was, must have turned them off while we were unaware. The only part of our story that our police captain took seriously was the girl, Maribel. The captain brought up a missing person report and asked us if this was the girl we saw. It was. It's been just a few days since I gave up the badge to save whatever little pride I could spare. I just ask to whoever reads this, and to whomever it may reach, the next time a door opens on its own, or things move by themselves in your home, check the mirrors. It started as a dare. My roommate Jake found the game on some obscure forum. The post was full of cryptic warnings and half-joking testimonials, the kind of thing you'd expect from a chain email circa 2005. Midnight calls, Jake read aloud, grinning like an idiot. All you have to do is play, follow the rules, and survive until dawn. Piece of cake. I rolled my eyes. What's the point? The point, he said, is that if you win, you get a wish. Anything you want. Money, fame, whatever. Yeah, or a virus on your phone. But Jake wouldn't let it go. By 11:50 p.m., he had convinced me to play with him. It was simple, he said. The game required 3 things: a smartphone, a candle, and darkness. We sat in the living room with the lights off, the flickering candle casting jagged shadows on the walls. Jake opened the app he'd downloaded. A plain black screen with a timer counting down to midnight. Ready? He asked. This is dumb, I muttered. The timer hit 0 and the phone screen changed. A message popped up. Do you wish to begin? Yes or no? Jake tapped yes without hesitation. My phone buzzed, showing the same screen. Reluctantly, I tapped yes. Rule 1, do not leave the house. Rule 2, keep your candle lit. Rule 3, answer when it calls. What does it mean by it? I asked. Jake shrugged. Guess we'll find out. The first 15 minutes were uneventful. We sat there in awkward silence, staring at our phones. Then Jake's phone buzzed, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. He answered, putting it on speaker. Hello? A voice, distorted and crackling, hissed through the speaker.
Would you like to continue?
Jake laughed nervously. Yeah? The line went dead. A new message popped up on his screen. Rule 4. Don't look behind you. I shivered despite myself. Okay, that's creepy. My phone buzzed next. I answered, my voice shaky. Hello? The same distorted voice, but this time it whispered my name. My stomach turned, but I forced myself to answer yes. The line clicked off, and a message appeared. Rule 5. Don't trust him. Don't trust who? I asked. Staring at the screen, Jake looked up, his face pale in the candlelight. What did it say? Nothing. We didn't talk after that. The air grew heavier, and the shadows seemed to stretch farther with each flicker of the candle. I thought I saw something move in the corner of my eye, but every time I turned, there was nothing there. Then Jake's candle went out. Shit, he hissed, scrambling to relight it. His hands were shaking so badly, he could barely hold the match. My phone buzzed again. Hello? The voice didn't whisper this time, it growled. I looked at Jake, who was still fumbling with his candle. What happens if I say no? The growl turned into a low, guttural laugh. The line went dead, and my phone flashed a message. Rule 6. Don't let him leave. Jake, I said slowly, you can't go outside. His head snapped up, his eyes wide. Why not? I don't know, but the game. This is insane. He stood, grabbing his phone. I'm done. Screw this stupid game. Before I could stop him, he headed for the front door. I lunged after him, but the moment he turned the knob, the air in the room shifted. It was like the atmosphere itself was sucked out, leaving behind a suffocating emptiness. Jake froze, his hand still on the doorknob. Jake? I whispered. He turned to face me, but it wasn't him anymore. His eyes were wrong, black and empty, and his mouth twisted into a grin that stretched too far.
You broke the rules,
he said. His voice layered with something deeper, something inhuman. I stumbled back, tripping over the coffee table. My candle flickered violently, and I scrambled to shield it. Jake, or whatever was wearing his face, stepped toward me.
You should have stopped him.
It hissed. The candle went out. The last thing I saw before the room plunged into darkness was Jake's face splitting open, revealing something sharp and glistening underneath. I woke up on the floor at dawn, the smell of burnt wax clinking to the air. Jake was gone. His phone sat on the table, screen shattered, the app nowhere to be found. There's one last rule they don't tell you. If you lose, the game keeps playing. Now every night at midnight, my phone buzzes. I don't answer, but I know someday I'll have to. I had been working late again, something I'd grown used to over the past few months. Chicago never truly sleeps, and it was common to see people still moving around the streets, even as the clock ticked past midnight. My apartment was just a few blocks away, and I'd made this walk home more times than I could count. The night was cool, the streetlights buzzing softly overhead as I made my way down the familiar route. There wasn't much traffic, which was typical for this time of night. The occasional car would pass, and sometimes I could hear the distant hum of the L train. I checked my phone out of habit, scrolling through notifications without really paying attention to them. A message from a friend asking about plans for the weekend. A reminder about a bill due tomorrow. Just the usual. As I approached my building, I noticed Tom, my neighbor, outside by the garbage bins. He had a cigarette between his fingers, the glowing lighting up his face briefly as he nodded in my direction. "Burning the midnight oil again?" he asked. "Yeah, work's been crazy lately," I replied, pausing for a moment before heading toward the door. "You? Couldn't sleep," he said, shrugging. "Figured I'd step out for a bit." I nodded, pushing the front door open. "See you around." "Take it easy," Tom replied before I disappeared inside. The elevator was sluggish as usual, and I found myself staring at the scratched-up panel of buttons. I lived on the 4th floor, and as the elevator crept upward, I glanced back at my phone. More notifications, more things to deal with tomorrow. When the elevator doors finally opened, I stepped into the quiet hallway. My apartment was at the far end, and I could see a faint light coming from under my door. I must have left the lamp on when I left earlier. Not unusual. I always forget little things like that. But when I reached my door, something caught my attention. The door wasn't closed all the way. It was barely noticeable, just a fraction of an inch, but it was enough to make me stop. I didn't remember leaving it like that. I stood there for a moment, staring at the door, my hand hovering just above the knob. I reached for the door, but as I grasped the knob, I froze. The door was unlocked. I was sure I had locked it before leaving, as I always did. I stood there staring at the knob, trying to make sense of it. Maybe I had been in such a hurry earlier that I forgot. But no, I distinctly remembered the click of the lock as I left. A knot tightened in my stomach as I pushed the door open. The apartment was quiet, everything seemingly in its place. The small lamp in the living room cast a soft glow, illuminating the familiar surroundings. I stepped inside and locked the door behind me, twisting the lock back and forth as if to reassure myself that it was working properly. I walked into the living room, tossing my keys onto the counter, and that's when I saw it. Lying on the coffee table where nothing had been earlier was a photograph. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't remember leaving it there, and more importantly, I didn't own any printed photos. I stepped closer, my heart thudding in my chest. The photo was of me, taken earlier today. On my walk from work, I recognized the street, the same one I had walked down just hours ago. My hand trembled as I picked it up, flipping it over to see if there was anything written on the back. There wasn't. Whoever took this photo had been watching me. They had followed me, and now they had been inside my apartment. I felt a rush of adrenaline, my mind racing with questions. How did they get in? Had I really left the door unlocked? I didn't think so. I quickly scanned the room again, looking for anything else that might have been moved, but everything seemed in place. I checked the windows, but they were locked too. Suddenly, my phone buzzed in my pocket, startling me. I pulled it out, half expecting to see a message from the stalker, but it was just Tom, my neighbor. "Hey, you okay? You looked kind of off earlier," his message read. I stared at the screen, my thoughts too scattered to reply right away. Tom had been outside when I came home. Could he have noticed something? Should I tell him about the photo? I hesitated for a moment, staring at Tom's message. Should I tell him about the photo? Part of me wanted to confide in someone, but another part felt like I needed to keep it to myself, at least for now. I didn't know what I was dealing with, and jumping to conclusions didn't feel right. After a long pause, I typed out a quick reply. Yeah, just a rough day at work. Thanks for checking in. I put my phone down, running my hand through my hair as I tried to steady my breathing. The photo still sat on the table, taunting me. My mind raced, thinking through all the possibilities. Who had taken it? Why leave it here? How did they get in? Trying to distract myself, I turned on the TV, hoping that some background noise would help calm my nerves, but I couldn't focus. My thoughts kept circling back to the unlocked door and the photo. It was almost like someone wanted me to know I was being watched, someone who knew I'd come home tonight and find their little message. I stood up and walked around the apartment, checking the windows again, though I knew they were already locked. My eyes wandered over every corner of the room, looking for anything else out of place. Nothing, just that photo. The buzz of my phone startled me again. Another message from Tom. If you need anything, let me know. I'm up for a while. I stared at the message, feeling uneasy. Tom had always been friendly, but now it seemed like he was paying extra attention. I hadn't noticed it before. But maybe I had never looked for it. Was I overthinking things? Or was it just a coincidence that he was always nearby, always checking in at the right time? I didn't respond to his message. Instead, I paced the room, glancing at the clock. It was past midnight now, and sleep felt impossible. My mind kept going over the day, trying to remember if I had seen anyone suspicious, anyone who might have followed me. Suddenly, a soft knock came at the door. The knock at the door sent a jolt through my body. I wasn't expecting anyone at this hour. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest, as I tiptoed toward the peephole. It was Tom, standing there with his hands in his pockets, looking casual. For a brief second, I felt relieved. Then I remembered the photo on the coffee table and the unlocked door. My nerves tightened again. I opened the door just a crack, trying to keep my voice steady. Hey, what's up? Tom smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. Sorry to bother you. I thought I heard something strange, like someone messing with your door earlier. Just wanted to check in, make sure you're okay. I blinked, trying to process what he was saying. You heard someone? Yeah, probably just some drunk or something, but it didn't seem right. Tom continued, his eyes flickering past me into the apartment. Thought I'd make sure everything was cool. My hand gripped the edge of the door tighter. I wasn't sure what to make of this. Tom had always been friendly, but the timing of his concern felt off, and if he had really heard something, why hadn't he called me or knocked earlier? I'm fine, I said quickly, trying to close the door a bit more. Thanks for checking in. Tom's smile faltered just a bit. Okay, well, just let me know if you need anything. I nodded, forcing a smile, before closing the door fully and locking it. As soon as I was alone again, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Something about the whole situation didn't sit right with me. I glanced back at the photo on the table, the reminder of someone having been inside watching me. My phone buzzed again, and I nearly jumped. Another message from Tom. Sorry if I freaked you out. Just being a good neighbor. I stared at the message, feeling my skin crawl. He was being too attentive, too involved. It was hard not to connect the dots. First the unlocked door, then the photo. And now Tom always seeming to be around at the perfect moment. I couldn't shake the feeling that he knew more than he was letting on. I decided I needed to talk to someone, so I called my friend Sarah. As the phone rang, I paced around the living room, my mind still racing. When she finally answered, her voice was groggy. "Hey, everything okay?" she asked, clearly half asleep. "I don't know," I admitted. "Something weird's been happening. Someone was in my apartment earlier, I think. They left a photo of me from today." There was a pause on the other end before Sarah spoke again. "That's creepy. Did you call the police?" "I'm not sure what to tell them, and I stopped mid-sentence, glancing at the coffee table again, where the photo still sat. It felt like it was staring back at me, an eerie reminder that someone had been close enough to take it. I don't even know what to say. What if they think I'm just overreacting? Sarah's voice grew more alert. You're not overreacting. Someone took a photo of you and left it in your apartment. That's serious. You need to call them. I bit my lip considering it. Maybe you're right, but it's just so bizarre. And Tom keeps checking on me. It's like he knows something, but I don't know if I'm being paranoid. Wait, Tom? Sarah asked, confused. Your neighbor? Yeah, I said, lowering my voice, even though I was alone. He's been around every time something weird happens. He texted me just after I found the photo. Said he saw someone hanging around my door. It's almost like he's watching me. Okay, that's weird. Do you think he could be involved? I don't know, I admitted, glancing nervously at the front door. He's always been friendly, but now it feels off. I don't know what to think. Sarah sighed. Look, I really think you should call the police, even if it's nothing. Better safe than sorry. And maybe keep your distance from Tom for a bit, just in case. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. Yeah, maybe I'll do that. Thanks, Sarah. Stay safe, okay? She said, her voice a little softer now. Call me if you need anything. After hanging up with Sarah, I sat in silence for a long moment, but she was right. It was better to be safe than sorry. I dialed the non-emergency number, feeling a wave of anxiety wash over me as I waited for them to pick up. When I finally spoke, my voice sounded smaller than I intended. I'd like to report something suspicious, I said, trying to keep my tone steady. I think someone's been watching me, and maybe even inside my apartment. The dispatcher took down my information, asking for the details of what had happened, with the photos and the sounds outside my door. I tried my best to explain, though it felt surreal, even as the words left my mouth. By the time the call ended, they assured me that an officer would be dispatched to check things out. It wasn't long before I heard the knock at the door. My heart jumped. But when I checked the people, I saw the distinct navy blue uniforms of 2 police officers standing just outside. Taking a deep breath, I opened the door and let them inside. One of the officers, a tall man with tired eyes, introduced himself. Ma'am, we're here to follow up on your report. Mind if we ask a few questions? I nodded, still feeling uneasy despite their presence. I led them into the living room, where they asked me to go over the events again in more detail. As I described the photos, the unlocked door, and the eerie feeling that I was being followed, the officer took notes, his partner occasionally glancing around the apartment. "Have you noticed anyone suspicious hanging around recently?" the officer asked. I hesitated. "There's my neighbor Tom. He's been really helpful, but I don't know. It's just a feeling. He's always around, checking on me, and it seems a little too inconvenient." The officer nodded, his expression unreadable. "We'll talk to him, just to cover all the bases." After I finished explaining everything, they went down the hall to speak with Tom. I stayed inside, pacing nervously, listening to the muffled conversation through the door. It wasn't long before the officers returned. "Your neighbor says he hasn't noticed anything unusual, but he's concerned for your safety," the officer said, his voice calm. He offered to keep an eye out for anything strange. I nodded, not sure if that made me feel better or worse. "Look, we don't have enough for a full investigation right now," the officer continued, "but we'll keep a patrol car parked outside tonight, just in case. You should try to get some rest." I thanked them, feeling a slight sense of relief at the idea of police nearby. Maybe now, with someone watching over the apartment, I could get some rest. I couldn't sleep. The events of the night replayed in my mind. The unsettling photos, the noises outside my door, and Tom's messages. The fear settled in deep, keeping me alert. Despite the police being outside, I stayed up all night, jumping at every creak in the apartment, every distant sound from the street. The small knife I had tucked into my bag for protection felt like my only source of comfort as dawn finally broke. The next day passed in a haze of routine, but the weight of the previous night's fear lingered at the back of my mind. I went through my workday mechanically, my body tired but my thoughts racing. By the time I finished my shift, the sky had already darkened, and I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. As I made my way home, I decided to stop by the convenience store a few blocks from my apartment. I needed something to help me unwind, maybe a snack and a drink to go with the movie I'd planned to watch. The store was brightly lit, a small beacon of normalcy amidst the growing shadows of the evening. I walked inside, the sound of the automatic doors hissing as they slid open. Grabbing a soda and a bag of chips, I wandered toward the counter, trying to shake the nerves that still clung to me. The cold night air felt sharp against my skin as I left the convenience store, clutching the plastic bag of snacks. Ever since I found those photos in my apartment, my nerves had been on edge. I kept one hand near the knife in my jacket pocket. As I walked quickly through the dimly lit parking lot, something didn't feel right, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The parking lot felt unnervingly still, the flickering streetlights casting long distorted shadows over the scattered cars. The silence pressed in around me, broken only by the faint hum of the lights overhead. I quickened my pace, the sound of my own footsteps, loud and uneven. My breath hitched, and I glanced back, expecting to see someone behind me, but there was no one. My heart pounded harder. Every instinct screamed at me to move faster. The shadows felt like they were closing in, stretching farther across the pavement as I hurried toward the far end of the lot. I tried to tell myself it was just paranoia, just the leftover fear from the night before. Then everything went dark. A bag was yanked over my head with brutal force, and strong arms wrapped around my throat, squeezing tight. Panic surged through me as I thrashed wildly, trying to scream, but the sound was muffled by the bag. My voice trapped inside. My lungs burned, desperate for air, but each breath came in shallow, choking gasps. The grip around my throat tightened, and my vision started to blur. My legs kicked out violently, but I couldn't break free. Every muscle in my body screamed for oxygen, for a way out, but the world around me was fading, slipping into darkness. I couldn't breathe, I couldn't think. My hand fumbled toward my pocket, feeling the cold steel of the knife. With the last ounce of strength I had left, I yanked it free and swung blindly behind me. I felt the blade hit flesh, and a low grunt of pain followed. The grip on my throat loosened, just enough for me to rip the bag from my head. I gasped for air, stumbling forward, vision swimming as I tried to regain my balance. My entire body trembled with fear and adrenaline, but I forced myself to turn around. He stood there, hunched over, clutching his side where I had slashed him. Blood poured between his fingers, staining the pavement beneath him. But his eyes were locked on me with a burning hatred. "Who are you?" I rasped, my voice shaking, barely able to speak. His twisted grin sent a shiver down my spine. "You don't remember me?" he said, his voice low, full of contempt. "Of course you don't." I stared at him, struggling to place his face. There was something familiar about him, but it was like grasping at a half-forgotten memory. "You think you're so much better than me," he hissed, taking a shaky step forward despite the wound. "You never even looked at me back then. You laughed, like I didn't matter." The memory hit me like a cold wave. High school. He had been there, always lurking in the background, quiet, unassuming. Someone I had barely noticed. I swallowed hard, dread settling deep in my chest. "You," I whispered, feeling a rising sense of horror. "I barely remember you. You rejected me like I was nothing." He took another step, his breath ragged. "But I swore you'd pay for it one day." My pulse raced as his words sank in. This wasn't just some random attack. He had planned this. He had been waiting for this moment, fueled by a hatred I hadn't even known existed. "I didn't want your love," he said, his voice trembling with anger. "I wanted you to feel what it's like to be nothing, to feel hunted, to feel powerless." I backed away, my heart pounding against my chest. "I don't understand," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "That was years ago." His face contorted with rage. "You thought you could laugh at me and walk away? But I've been waiting. I've been waiting all this time to make you suffer." His legs gave out and he collapsed to the ground, blood pooling beneath him as his breath came in shallow gasps. I stood there paralyzed, watching him struggle to breathe, trying to comprehend the nightmare that had unfolded in front of me. A boy I barely remembered from my past had plotted his revenge for years, and now he had come for me. Then I heard it, the soft chime of a text message. My pulse quickened as I looked down at his limp body. His phone must have gone off. My hands shook as I crouched down, reaching toward his jacket pocket. For a moment I hesitated, but then I forced my hand inside. I pulled out his phone, the screen still glowing with a new notification. The message read, "Did you get the job done?" I opened the conversation. and what I saw made my blood freeze. There were photos of me walking to work, leaving my apartment, moving through my daily life. He had been watching me for weeks, maybe longer. Each photo was sent to him with a chilling calculated precision. My breath came in short, panicked gasps as I scrolled up further. The stalker had been communicating with someone else, someone who had been helping him all along. My blood ran cold as I read through the exchange. Make sure she finds the pictures. Tonight's the night. I'm going to finish this. Then came the reply from earlier that night. I don't care what you do, as long as I get paid. With growing terror, I pulled out my own phone and compared the unknown number to my contacts. My hands shook violently as I scrolled through my list, praying I was wrong. But when I saw the match, my heart plummeted. It was Tom. A wave of nausea hit me as the realization set in. Tom, the friendly neighbor who had always been so concerned, so helpful, had been involved from the beginning. He had been feeding information to my stalker, planting the photos, manipulating me, all for money. I felt numb as I dialed the police, my voice shaking as I tried to explain everything. Tom had betrayed me in the worst possible way, and I had never even suspected him. It didn't take long. A knock at Tom's door echoed through the hallway, louder than I'd ever heard before. I stepped out into the corridor, standing in the shadows. As the police spoke to him, I held my breath as I watched the scene unfold. Tom opened the door, calm as ever, his face the picture of confusion. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice dripping with Fox innocence. They moved swiftly, stepping inside. Within moments, Tom was in handcuffs, his calm facade cracking ever so slightly. His eyes locked onto mine. Just for a second as they led him past me down the hallway. "You were always so easy to fool," he said, his voice low, cold, and with a grim smirk on his face. How could I have been so blind? He had been right there, pretending to care, pulling the strings the entire time. As I sat in my apartment, alone and shaken, I realized how close I had come to losing everything. Not just my life, but my sense of trust. I thought I had known who the real danger was, but the truth had been right in front of me the whole time, hidden behind a neighbor's smile. I moved into the house last month. It was one of those charming, old colonial homes with creaking wooden floors and ivy creeping up the walls, a dream for someone like me, who always loved the idea of history clinging to every corner. The realtor mentioned it was over 100 years old, and though it needed some repairs, it felt like the perfect place to call my own. The first night in the house was quiet, almost too quiet. It's funny how you never notice the absence of sound until it's gone. I didn't hear the hum of cars in the distance. No people walking down the street, just pure silence. It should have been peaceful, but instead, it left me with a nagging feeling of unease. It started on the third night. I was lying in bed, drifting between sleep and wakefulness, when I heard a faint scratching sound. I sat up, groggy, trying to figure out where it was coming from. I thought maybe it was just a mouse or some other rodent. Old houses are prone to pests, after all. But as I listened more closely, it sounded like something bigger, something deliberate. It was coming from the walls. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that it was probably just an animal. Maybe a raccoon or a possum had gotten into the crawl space. But every night the noise got worse. What started as a faint scratching soon turned into what sounded like whispering. It was so faint I couldn't make out the words. But there was something disturbingly human about it. I called an exterminator, thinking that whatever was in there needed to be dealt with. They came, searched the house, and found nothing. No signs of rodents, no nests, no entry points. They assured me there was nothing in the walls, but the sounds continued. One night, the whispering grew louder. I sat up in bed, heart racing, straining to hear. I couldn't deny it anymore. The voices were there, just behind the wall of my bedroom, and they were speaking. Words slurred together in low, guttural tones, too quiet to understand, but unmistakably there. Then something tapped against the wall. It was slow, methodical, like someone knocking from the other side. I jumped out of bed and pressed my ear to the wall, trying to hear. The whispering stopped, and for a moment there was silence again. But then the wall shifted. I don't know how else to describe it. It felt like something inside the wall moved. Something alive. I could feel the vibrations under my hand, like a deep hidden pulse. My stomach churned, and I backed away slowly, afraid to look away, but terrified of staying too close. I hardly slept that night. The next day, I called a contractor to check the walls, hoping it was just faulty wiring or some structural issue. He tore open part of the wall where I'd heard the noise, but all he found was the usual wood insulation, nothing out of the ordinary. He patched it up, and I pretended for a while that it was enough to make me feel safe. That night, I decided to record the sounds. I left my phone on with a voice recording app running, propped up against the wall where the sounds had been the loudest. I lay in bed, the sheets pulled tight around me, and waited. The whispering returned, but this time it was clearer. The words still made no sense, like they were spoken in a language I couldn't understand. But as I listened through the thin walls, I realized something horrifying. The voices weren't just random. They were responding to me. They would grow louder when I moved, and quiet when I stayed still. At one point, I couldn't take it anymore and shouted, "What do you want?" The whispering stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but the pounding of my heart. Then a single word came through the wall, clear as day. "You." I froze. The air in the room felt thick and oppressive, like it was pressing in on me from all sides. I grabbed my phone, too scared to play back the recording, and ran out of the house. I've been staying in a hotel ever since, but I can still hear the whispering in my dreams. I know I have to go back eventually. It's my home after all, but I don't know if I can, because whatever is in the walls wants me, and I don't know how to stop it. The station wagon lurched along the deserted back roads, its engine a low growl that seemed to echo through the dense fog, clinking to the outskirts of town. The city lights were long gone, swallowed by the dark. Robert Usted's eyes flicked repeatedly to the rear-view mirror. There was no one behind him, but he kept checking, just in case. He gripped the steering wheel, fingers stiff and pale, jaw set tight. Paranoia had seeped into every thought, every nerve. He wasn't escaping. This wasn't about getting away. This was about proving a point. One final message to the ones who had hunted him, who had turned his life into a cornered animal's nightmare. In the back seat, 2 small bodies lay crumpled and limp. The soft glow of the dashboard threw their faces into harsh relief, empty eyes staring into nothing. There was a metallic smell hanging in the air, sharp and bitter. It hadn't been planned, not really. He just wanted to keep them safe, to protect them from the people who were always watching. But his own hands had betrayed him, his rage blinding him, and now what was left of his family was gone. It was too late to turn back. His wife sat gagged beside him, eyes glazed over. She had stopped crying hours ago. There was no pleading, no desperate attempts to get through to him, just silent tears and the rise and fall of her chest. She knew he was beyond saving, lost in the labyrinth of his own fears. The car swerved suddenly, tires skidding on loose gravel as it veered off the paved road and onto a dirt path. It kicked up a cloud of dust that hovered like a ghost in the taillights. Ahead, the outline of a fence materialized in the darkness. Beyond it, a wide empty field stretched out under the moonlight. Skeletal trees lined the far edge, their branches like claws, reaching for the sky. An old barn sagged in the distance, a hulking shadow against the pale light. This was it, the end. He turned to his wife, his breath coming in sharp, uneven gasps. "They'll remember this," he whispered hoarsely, his voice almost swallowed by the night. "They'll remember what happened here." The device beneath his seat was crude, hastily assembled from pipes and wires, packed tight with potential. It sat there waiting. All it would take was a turn of the key, one twist, and it would be over, a single flash, and they would never forget him. She didn't react, didn't even look at him. Her gaze was fixed somewhere far away, staring through the windshield, unseeing. It was as if she had turned to stone, her spirit drained. There was no fight left in her, no defiance. What was there to fight for? Her children, pale and still in the back seat, were beyond her reach. The last shreds of her resistance had crumbled away. She was empty now, a shell, caught in a nightmare that had no end. Robert's hand hovered over the key, his breathing slowed. This place, this field, these trees would become a marker, a scar. He could see them out there, hidden in the darkness. The ones who had driven him to this, they would understand. He would make them understand. His lips curled into a thin smile, his grip tightening on the key. The explosion shattered the night. A violent, blinding burst of fire tore through the vehicle, metal folding inward like paper. Shards of glass and twisted steel rained down as the flames roared, engulfing everything. The blast seemed to consume the sky itself, a towering inferno that burned brighter than day. Then silence, the kind of silence that felt final, the kind that smothered everything. Smoke billowed up in thick black plumes, blotting out the stars. Somewhere deep in the pasture, horses whinnied in terror, their dark shapes bolting in every direction. Their hooves pounded the earth, a chaotic rhythm against the stillness of the night. The field, once peaceful and quiet, was a smoldering ruin. Shattered glass glinted in the firelight, and twisted metal lay strewn like bones. The barn stood untouched, a silent witness to the madness that had consumed Robert Usted. All that remained was a charred shell and the acrid scent of scorched earth, a testament to a man who had lost everything and left nothing but destruction in his wake. The silence in the room was broken only by the soft rustle of pages being turned, the occasional crackle of the fire, and the low rumble of distant thunder rolling in from the horizon. Each of us sat around the cozy living room, hunched over our own copies of Paranoia, eyes fixed on the lines describing the final horrific moments of Robert Usted's delusion-driven rampage. The words painted vivid, gruesome pictures in my mind. The shattered glass, the fire, the blood. It was the kind of story that gripped your chest and refused to let go. As I turned the last page of the chapter, my hand trembled slightly. Stacy's voice broke the tension first. "Holy hell," she breathed, lowering her book slowly, as though the weight of what she'd read still lingered in her hands. That was intense. She looked up at us wide-eyed, the excitement in her expression tinged with something darker. A sliver of fear, maybe. She brushed her hair back behind her ear, as if trying to shake off the lingering discomfort. I can't believe they managed to capture it so well. The dread, the absolute madness of it all. Axel nodded. His own copy closed now, resting on his lap. He glanced at her, then over at Margaret and me, a faint smirk playing on his lips. "I think I need a drink after that," he joked, though his voice held an edge of unease. "It's like I can feel the crazy radiating off the pages." Margaret set her book down gently beside her on the sofa, her gaze distant, unfocused. "It's tragic," she murmured. "The children, the wife. It's hard to imagine what it must have been like for her. I mean, knowing she was going to die and just not fighting anymore." She shook her head slowly, hugging her arms around herself. Reading it made me feel sick, like I was there in that car, feeling everything she must have felt. "I know," I agreed quietly. The flames of the fire seemed to cast long, wavering shadows across the room, making everything feel a little less real. The author really captured it. The sense of isolation, the paranoia. It was like you could see into Robert's head, see how the world twisted and warped around him until he didn't know what was real anymore. Stacy leaned forward, elbows on her knees, her eyes alight with the kind of excitement that only comes from being scared and fascinated at the same time. "That's what makes it so powerful, don't you think?" she said eagerly. "It's not just some gory crime story. It's the psychology of it all, the way it crawls under your skin and makes you think about how easily someone can just snap." She paused, then grinned. "That's why I wanted us all to read it." Axel's smile faltered slightly. He glanced toward the window, where the first faint flashes of lightning lit up the sky. "Well, you succeeded," he muttered. "I'm definitely freaked out now." He glanced back at Stacy, raising an eyebrow. "But that's not why you brought us together tonight, is it?" Stacy's grin widened, a mischievous spark flickering in her eyes. "Maybe it was," she teased. "But maybe I also thought it'd be a good idea for us to, do a little field trip. A way to, what's the phrase? Get some closure." Margaret stiffened beside me. "You're not serious," she said softly. "You don't really want to go out there, do you? To that place?" "Well, why not?" We're only a couple of miles away from the exact spot it all happened, Stacy shot back, eyes gleaming in the firelight. We've been living with this story for weeks. We're all caught up in the fear, the mystery. It's just a field now. It's not like anything's going to jump out at us. Axel shifted uncomfortably, glancing at me. I knew he felt the same pull I did, a strange, almost magnetic curiosity. But there was something else, too. Something that made my stomach twist with dread. I looked at Margaret. She was staring at Stacy, like she'd lost her mind. It's just an empty patch of land, I said slowly, and the only thing we're likely to find there is a chill from the wind. Exactly, Stacy said, leaning back in her chair, a satisfied smile spreading across her face. Don't you see? That's why we have to go. We have to finish what we started. It'll be like closing a chapter. The storm outside rumbled closer, and in the flickering light of the fire, no one moved. No one spoke up to say it was a bad idea. Even Margaret, who looked the most apprehensive, remained silent, her eyes shifting between the rest of us, waiting for someone else to call it off, but no one did. We'll go now, Stacy murmured, almost to herself. She stood up slowly, like someone in a trance. Before the storm hits, we'll go, and then we'll see what's really out there. A chill ran down my spine, but I pushed it aside. We had gone this far. There was no turning back now. The night air was heavy as we stepped out of Axel and Stacy's warm, comfortable living room and into the chill of the oncoming storm. The faint scent of rain lingered in the wind, mixing with the crisp scent of freshly turned earth and distant pine. The sky above was bruised with deep purples and angry grays, lit intermittently by flashes of far-off lightning. I could feel the storm's charge pricking at my skin, as if the very air itself was alive with anticipation. Part of me wanted to stay behind, to make up some excuse and wait it out by the fire. But another part, one I didn't want to acknowledge, urged me forward with morbid curiosity. We piled into Axel's car, nerves jittery, none of us speaking as the engine roared to life. The interior of the car was warm, but the tension was suffocating. Stacy was up front, staring out into the gathering darkness. Like a woman on a mission, I exchanged a look with Margaret beside me, who gave a tight, uneasy smile. She didn't want to go either, but we'd all made this unspoken pact the moment no one objected at the end of dinner. Now we were all prisoners to our own pride. The drive out to the pasture was longer than I expected. The streets grew narrower, winding through fields and clusters of trees, their bare branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. We passed darkened houses, spaced far apart, their windows like blind eyes, staring out into the void. Walla Walla was a small, quiet town, but this felt different. Our hometown now seemed abandoned, empty in a way it never had before. With each turn, the storm crept closer, flashes of lightning illuminating the road for split seconds, before plunging us back into a hollow darkness. Thunder rumbled louder now, a low growl that reverberated through the car and settled deep in my chest. I can't believe we're doing this, Axel muttered suddenly. Breaking the silence, he glanced back at me in the rearview mirror, his eyes shadowed and uncertain. You know, it's probably just going to be an empty field. Nothing to see but grass and an old fence. Then why go at all? Margaret shot back, her voice sharper than she intended. I could see her grip tightening on her knees, fingers digging into the fabric of her jeans. Because we have to, Stacy said softly. Her gaze was still fixed straight ahead, unblinking. Because it's part of the story. You know how the book ends, right? We're almost at the last chapter. Yeah, in the book, I pointed out, trying to keep my tone light, but it came out strained. This isn't a novel, Stace. There's no closure out there, just an old crime scene and a creepy pasture. Exactly, she turned in her seat, eyes gleaming with an unsettling intensity. It's been 30 years. Maybe it's time to put the story to rest for real. No one had a response to that. I looked out the window instead, watching the trees blur by as the road narrowed even further. The last thing I wanted was to trapeze around some dark pasture where a man had killed his family. But I couldn't bring myself to say it, not when everyone else seemed determined to see this through. Finally, we turned down a dirt road, the tires crunching softly over gravel. By now, the sky had shifted from dusk to night, but the moon was low enough in the sky that its light skirted below the black clouds, illuminating the ground with an eerie, unearthly glow. Axel slowed the car, squinting out the windshield, as the headlights washed over a barbed wire fence and a stretch of empty pasture beyond. The field looked almost silver under the moonlight, the tall grass rippling gently in the breeze like the surface of a dark, shimmering sea. "This is it," Axel said, his voice barely above a whisper. We got out of the car slowly, as if we were afraid of disturbing something, some delicate, invisible thread holding the world in place. The wind tugged at my clothes, and I could taste the storm on my tongue. Thunder rumbled closer now, the sky flickering with bursts of pale, cold light. The four of us stood by the fence, peering out into the expanse of the pasture. In the distance, I could just make out the faint outline of trees, black and skeletal against the horizon. The grass swayed and whispered softly in the wind, as if murmuring secrets we weren't meant to hear. "It looks normal," Margaret said quietly, almost like she was afraid to be proven wrong. Stacy nodded slowly, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Disappointment maybe, or relief, I couldn't tell. She reached out and placed her hand on the top wire of the fence, the metal gleaming faintly in the dim light. "Let's just go a little way in," she said softly, "just to say we did." None of us wanted to be the one to refuse, so we followed her lead. We slipped through a gap in the wire, the grass parting softly around us. It was colder here, the air biting and sharp. Each step felt heavy, like the earth itself was trying to drag us down. Axel and I took the lead, our footsteps muffled by the thick grass. Stacy and Margaret stayed close behind, their silhouettes flickering in and out of focus as the lightning flashed above. We moved deeper into the field, the fence receding into the distance behind us until it was just a dark line against the horizon. We came to another fence, this one lower than the last one behind us, perhaps 4 feet tall. It was made up of horizontal metal bars spaced apart, leaving gaps just big enough for a person to squeeze between them. It was a cattle fence, At one time, the bars were probably painted a bright color, but now they were rusted and corrupted by time. Stacy passed right by Axel and me, and without saying a word, she began to try and climb over the fence. "That's far enough," I said, finally allowing a sliver of reason to win over my conscience. Stacy scoffed at me and looked at Axel with an expression that told him to give her permission to proceed, but he sheepishly refused with another nonverbal cue. "Cowards," she muttered as she stepped down. The night seemed to press in around us, the silence growing heavier with each passing second. Stacy stood beside me, peering around like she was searching for something. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. We all froze, straining our ears. For a moment there was only the distant rumble of thunder, but then faint, almost imperceptible. I caught the sound of something moving through the grass. A soft shuffling noise, like someone or something was wading slowly through the tall stalks. "It's just the wind," Axel said quickly. Though his voice shook slightly, he turned in a slow circle, scanning the field. "There's nothing out here." "Then why do I feel like I'm being watched?" Margaret's voice was barely a whisper, tight with fear. I didn't answer. I was too focused on the sound, the way it seemed to come closer, then fade away, only to creep back in again. A chill crept down my spine, every nerve in my body on edge, and then, as if summoned by the very thought, I saw it. At first, it was just a shape in the distance, a pale blur against the dark backdrop of the field. My heart stuttered, and I blinked, convinced I was imagining things. But no, there it was. A figure, ghostly white and shimmering faintly in the moonlight, standing near the far end of the pasture. It was too large to be a person, too solid to be a trick of the light. My throat tightened as the shape shifted, moving slowly toward us. "Hey, look at that!" Stacy's voice was bright, almost excited. She stepped up onto the bottom rung of the fence, balancing with one hand on the top bar as she squinted out into the field. "It's just a horse." She glanced back at us, grinning, clearly unimpressed. "See? Nothing creepy here. Just somebody's stray farm animal." Axel seemed to relax beside me, his shoulders loosening as he peered out into the dark. "Yeah, she's right. It's probably just lost or something." He turned to Margaret and me, raising an eyebrow. "See? Nothing to worry about." But Margaret didn't respond. Her grip tightened on my arm, nails digging in through my jacket. "It doesn't feel right, Jeff," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rustling grass. "There's something wrong with it." I couldn't shake the same feeling. There was something off about the way it moved. Too smooth, too deliberate, like it was gliding rather than walking. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to speak. "We should leave," I murmured. "Right now." "Don't be ridiculous," Stacy shot back, waving a hand dismissively. "It's just a horse, for God's sake." She raised her voice, her tone playful, almost mocking. "Hey there, horsey. Come here, sweetie. Come on, come say hi." She started making soft coaxing noises, the kind you'd use to call a pet, kissy sounds, little clicks of her tongue. I watched, my stomach knotting with unease, as the horse seemed to pause, its head tilting slightly in her direction. Then, slowly, it began to move again. The odd thing was, it didn't look like it was moving very fast. It was almost ambling, the way a horse might stroll leisurely across a paddock. But something about the movement was wrong. It was getting closer, quicker than it should have been, covering more ground than its slow steps should allow. One moment it was a distant shape on the far side of the field, and the next it was halfway across the pasture, its form blurring at the edges as though it were slipping in and out of focus. "What the hell?" Axel muttered, his voice tight with confusion. He leaned forward, squinting at the horse. "How is it moving so fast?" "It's not," Stacy insisted, her smile faltering slightly. "It just looks like it is. Maybe it's the moonlight, or I don't know. Fog or something?" She glanced around, her gaze darting over the dark expanse of the field. "It's just a trick of the light." But even as she spoke, I saw her expression change. She stepped up higher on the fence, her hand still outstretched. "Come on, horsey," she called softly, though there was a tremor in her voice now. "Come here." The horse obliged, or at least it seemed to. It was closer again, closer than it should have been. Its body shimmered faintly in the moonlight, its pale coat almost glowing. But the closer it came, the more details I could make out, and the more wrong it looked. The legs were too long, the joints bending awkwardly. The head, which had seemed so horse-like from a distance, looked distorted now. The muzzle stretched too thin, the ears set too far back. I took an involuntary step back, bumping into Margaret. She gasped, clutching at my arm. "Jeff," she breathed, her voice trembling. "That's not a horse." Stacy hesitated, her gaze locked on the creature as it continued its surreal approach. For a second, I thought she'd back down, that she'd see what we were seeing. But then she huffed, rolling her eyes in mock annoyance. "Stop being such babies," she said, though her voice wavered. She turned back to the creature, putting on a wide, forced smile. "Hey, horsey, come on, come here." The horse stopped abruptly, just a few yards away. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tensing. Its head lowered slightly, and it seemed to be looking at us. No, not us, at Stacy. Its eyes, dark and unblinking, fixed on her like it was studying her. "Okay, that's close enough," Axel muttered, reaching up to tug at Stacy's sleeve. "Let's get out of here." But she didn't move. Her hand was still outstretched, her fingers trembling slightly. "Come here, horsey," she whispered, almost pleading now, and then the horse tilted its head, just a fraction enough for the moonlight to catch on its face, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The mouth, oh God, the mouth, stretched too wide, the lips pulling back in a grotesque parody of a smile. Rows of teeth gleamed wetly in the pale light, jagged and uneven. Its eyes, which had seemed almost normal from a distance, were pits of darkness, bottomless and empty. "Stacy," I croaked, but my voice was a thin, useless thread of sound. I couldn't move, couldn't look away. "Get down, now!" But she didn't seem to hear me. She was frozen, staring at the thing in front of her, her arm still reaching out as if caught in some horrible trance. The horse, or whatever it was, shifted again, its head tilting the other way. Then slowly, impossibly, and without moving its smiling mouth, it spoke, mimicking Stacy's voice in a low, haunting, twisted whisper. "Hey, come here. Come say hi." It sounded too low for us to hear, but all of us did. deep within our ear canals and in our chests. And that's when she screamed. Simultaneously, Margaret fell down, her chest colliding hard with the cold, damp ground, as though she had been pushed by an invisible force from behind. It was then that the deafening sound of running, stampeding horse hooves filled the air like an explosion, yet the white horse remained hauntingly still, glaring at us through its unearthly eyes. The sound shattered the silence, raw and terrified, echoing across the field. Axel lunged forward, grabbing Stacy around the waist and yanking her off the fence. As I helped Margaret up off the ground, Stacy struggled for a moment, her limbs flailing, and then she seemed to snap back to herself, turning and bolting toward the car. "Run!" I shouted, my voice breaking. "Run!" We didn't need to be told twice. We sprinted back toward the car, the grass whipping at our legs, the wind howling in our ears. The horse, or whatever it was, remained where it stood, watching us with that awful predatory smile. But even as I ran, I could feel its gaze burning into my back, following us all the way. We piled into the car, Axel slamming the doors shut and jamming the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and with gravel kicking up, we tore away from the field, leaving the horrific twisted creature behind. But even as the car sped down the narrow dirt road, I couldn't shake the image from my mind. The sight of that pale, grinning face, watching us go. Back in the car we sat in stunned silence, the interior heavy with an unspoken fear that none of us wanted to address. Axel was clutching the steering wheel so tightly, his knuckles were white, staring blankly at the empty field beyond. Stacy, for once, was speechless, her face pale and eyes wide, as she exchanged a horrified look with Margaret. Did you see its face?" Margaret whispered finally, voice shaky. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry, and nodded slowly. "Yeah," I managed. That wasn't a horse. Hell with its face. Did you hear that thing speak? It fucking spoke. Horses don't speak like that," Axel said frantically. We sat there, breathing hard, trying to process what had just happened. The air in the car felt suffocating, and I could see everyone else was just as rattled. Stacy was the first to break the silence. "We need to find out if there's a horse that lives here," she said, her voice shaky but resolute. "What, you want to go back out there and knock on someone's door?" Axel snapped, turning to glare at her. But Stacy was already shaking her head, a wild glint in her eyes. No, we'll call them. If it's a horse they own, we'll get an answer tonight. If not, well, I don't know." "Why would anyone keep a horse like that?" Margaret muttered. "It looked wrong, like it was sick or—" "Let's just get back home first," Axel said, plunging the car back into silence. After pulling into Stacy and Axel's driveway, we sat for a second, contemplating all that had occurred. Axel was the first to get out, and the rest of us followed. Once inside, we found a phone book and watched as Stacy flipped through the thin, yellowed pages. Finally, she found the address. There indeed was a house on the property we just hadn't seen. Stacy read the address aloud, matching it to the field's location. It was them, with trembling fingers. She dialed the number listed in the directory. The phone rang 3 times before a woman's voice answered, curt and wary, like she'd already been interrupted one too many times that evening. "Hello? Hi, ma'am," Stacy stammered, struggling to keep her voice steady. "Sorry to bother you so late, but we were driving by your property and we thought we saw a white horse out in your field. We just wanted to make sure it hasn't gotten out." There was a pause, an uncomfortable, drawn-out silence that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I leaned closer, holding my breath, straining to catch every word. Then the woman let out a long, exasperated sigh. "For the last time," she said, her voice sharp and brittle. "We don't have a white horse." My heart dropped. The way she said it, like she'd been repeating it for years, like people had been asking her this same question over and over, sent a cold, prickling chill through my entire body. "What do you mean?" Stacy asked, confusion and fear lacing her tone. Are you sure? Because The line went dead. We stared at the phone, stunned. Stacy looked up slowly, her face pale as a ghost. She just hung up on me," she whispered. "Because we're not the first to ask," I murmured, dread coiling in my stomach. "People have seen it before." The silence stretched out for an eternity. I looked out the window, and rain had begun to soak it. I imagined the rain falling onto the ground of that field, where the horrible crime had taken place so long ago. I hoped that the life-giving water would wash away the stains of the past, and maybe that thing would go away. But I knew better. Evil like that doesn't just wash away, it lingers. The creature was there because of the sins of Robert Usted. That horrible act had tainted the ground of that place, and only something unholy could call it home now. But that made me wonder, what the hell had we seen?